Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. In the episode of today, I will talk about how the two world wars shaped the ideas of the decolonized movement and how eventually after 1945, in the following decades, the different nations gained self-independence, like in Africa, in Asia, and in many areas all over the world. I will base my episode on a very interesting essay written by the historian Rudolf von Albertini, which is called The Impact of Two World Wars on the Decline of Colonialism. Von Albertini started the essay mentioning how before the First World War, in the time pre-1914, there were national movements which were trying to gain self-governments in areas like Algeria, Indochina, China, Egypt, and so on. Then, with the start of the First World War, many of the people in the colonies support the Allies. So here it seems that there was a paradox, because even though the people in those colonies wanted to gain independence from the rulers, which mostly were Great Britain and France, but also the Netherlands in Indonesia, they support the Allies' effort against Germany and Austria. This was according to a von Albertini because the people were mobilized for the war effort, and in doing so they felt some kind of loyalty to the colonizers, but also most important because they saw that this was a chance for them to push with their reform. In other words, they felt that if they behave correctly as they were expected by the rulers, they will be able to create the new measures which will benefit overall to their own nation, which was in the making. The best example of that, it was without any doubt Mohandas Gandhi, which he supported widely the war effort, supporting Great Britain against Germany. And the thing is, like, for instance, he organized the Indian Ambulance Unit. So even though Gandhi was a proponent of the pacifist movement, non-violence, and so on, he became hugely involved between 1914 and 1918, supporting the effort for the Allies. Obviously, after the First World War, the years later, these kind of countries become disenchanted because the colonizer did not fulfill their promises with them. It is true that they pushed some reforms in Algeria, into China, Egypt, and so on, but they were considered insufficient by the elites of the colonies. In that sense, people like Gandhi in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940 become a leader for the decolonized movement all over the world. We have his example, also Nehru, the future first prime minister of the newly independent India in 1947, Ho Chi Minh, the guerrilla fighter who became the leader of Vietnam when it got the independence from France in 1954, and we have other examples all over the world. The thing is, like, in the last years of the First World War, even though the colonized people support the war effort, they were eventually tired because they were being conscripted to go into the front, they were being killed in thousands, so they started to revolt within the war. The compulsory draft was essential for this uprising according to von Albertini, and the thing is, like, when these people were sent to the front, they shared different ideas which later on permeate in the society. So you have to imagine that many of the people who were conscripted were taken from the rural areas where they were isolated from different people, but sadly they saw themselves among hundreds of people from their own nation, and they could share their concerns, their ideas, their aims, and so on, and this helped to create a movement. Also, during those years, in order to support the war effort, there was an economic upheaval which shaped the colonies forever. In that sense, we have huge levels of industrialization in countries which were traditionally agrarian. This helped to join a lot of working class people. This consequently created trade unions, and the number of wage earners increased. So suddenly you had the creation of a kind of middle class, but also the working class. Because the middle class, which were a minority, were able to spend money in commodities, the prices rose, and this generated more discontent among the masses. In that sense, Mrs. Besant, a congresswoman in 1917 at the Calcutta Congress, point how this movement that was happening all over the world with the discontent of the mass of people was the awakening of Asia, which happened before and during the war. So, in other words, the First World War changed the sociological conception of the people living in India, in Egypt, in Indochina, Indonesia, Algeria, and other areas, but also with the shift in the structural economic system, more focused now to the war effort rather than the traditional agrarian system. It also created the material conditions in which people could join together, share their own ideas, join in trade unions, and eventually this was fundamental for the overthrow of the colonizers, but that had to wait for many decades later. Perhaps the best example of this kind of coalescing of different people together happened in Indonesia, which the number of members in the union shift increased dramatically between 1912 and 1917. And in that sense, in October of 1917, the Indonesian created a huge upheaval in the country. This was following the Russian Revolution, which obviously had a deep influence in the so-called Third World. At the time, it was decolonized. Precisely in 1920, the Communist Party was founded in Indonesia, and this was it became later the greatest communist party all over the world, apart from the one in the Soviet Union, with millions of members. Apart from that, you have the Egyptian national movement in India, and apart from the Russian Revolution, there was other aspect that had great influence in this movement. It was when the President Wilson drew his program, which was called the 14 Points, in which he accepted the right of self-determination of the colonies, same as Lenin did with the Russia after 1917, after the Bolshevik Revolution. So you have here influence in the worldwide sphere as a consequence of the First World War, and this shaped the ideas carried by the colonies in the decades of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. Obviously, this also creates contradictions because as Great Britain and France made some concessions to the colonies, this benefit mainly to the white elites, and this increased the segregation between the white rich people and the poor black. Obviously, this will create resentment in next decade, and the apartheid system of South Africa was perhaps the most illustrative event about this situation. Going through the interwar period and even the Second World War, we have also the same situation as in the first. The colonizers, Britain, the Dutch, France, they draw from the people living in those colonies to make the war effort. In that sense, according to Bonalbertini, the manifestation of loyalty from those people were clearly linked with demands for reform. In that sense, the war offered a suitable opportunity for demanding autonomy or even independence. In Algeria, this was very clear when Ferhat Abbas, which was the leader of the Algerian movement, dropped his former plea for integration and assimilation and demanded the establishment of an Algerian state, announcing this in the Algerian Manifesto, of February 1943. This year is important because Algeria, that was a French colony, had been submitted to the Vichy regime, which this started in 1940, in June of 1940, after Germany invaded France and France surrendered, with the creation of the Vichy government in France that also permeated into the colonies. But the Allies reached Algeria in 1942, I think it was in November of that year, and henceforth, with the arrival of the Americans and other allies, these natives, the people in the colonies, felt emboldened to push for radical reforms than before. In that sense, Charles de Gaulle, for instance, sought to counter this kind of radical movement for independence, granting civil rights to the Islamic people, which that was a kind of implementation of the Popular Front idea in 1936, 1937, carried by Léon Blum, the former French president of the Third Republic. However, this faced a setback because while the Soviet Union was supporting the independence movement all over the world, the United States also favor a policy of anti-colonialism. In that sense, Great Britain and France, which had occupied most of the world in the last century, were being forced to let go their colonies, because while the Soviet Union had defeated the Nazis in the Battle of Stalingrad, the help of the United States to defeat Japan will be fundamental later on in the war, and henceforth the two main powers had to let space for the two new hegemonic countries, which again were the Soviet Union and the United States. In the mind of people, according to Von Albertini, the defeat of Great Britain and France in the colonies, also through the invasion of Japan in different Asian countries, which forced them to retreat, create this idea that the divine power that allegedly had Great Britain and France in those areas collapsed. In other words, they felt that the narrative that has been created for many decades in order to subjugate the masses could not sustain itself anymore. In that sense, the invasion of Japan was fundamental for the uprising of the masses, because the Japanese replaced the language of the European rulers by national language and awakened hopes that independence would soon be granted. There were also anti-imperialist slogans that were aimed with a characteristic ambivalence against the Allies, France and Great Britain, but also on Japan, because even though they were trying to, in some sense, accommodate the colonies, they were at the same time oppressing the people, taking families from the rural areas to sustain the war effort, same as Great Britain and France had done in the First World War. So this created a feeling of resentment. Japan also let the creation of the armies in those Asian colonies, and eventually these armies allied with the national movement. So it was a backlash against the Japan invasion, and also the creation of the radio in Japan in order to spread the news across the different countries was taken in Indonesia by the nationalists, which were mostly integrated by members of the Communist Party in order to appeal to the masses to uprise. This also happened in Indochina when the Communist Party of Ho Chi Minh went to declare the Indo-Chinese Republic in 1946, although they had to fight for 8 more years until they defeat the French in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu to achieve the independence of Indochina, in which later became Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So just to finish the episode, we can conclude how the importance of the different movements across the world was fundamental for the decolonization, how the push of the Soviet Union and the influence of the United States was also fundamental to embolden the demands of the colonies, also the change of the structures in the agrarian societies, was also important to hold people together, create this idea of social consciousness, mutual aid among the masses in the nations, in order to join together and in the future achieve independence. At the same time, there was a generational process, which meant that the people who had joined the national movement in the First World War period, 30 years later, they were older and they could not lead those kind of social movement. However, the new elites, which were students that had been in London and in France and in different areas, such as Nkrumah, the future Prime Minister of Ghana, Nehru, the future Prime Minister of India, and other leaders like Sukarno, Nasser later on, and many other important people had influence directly from the metropolis, and henceforth they had developed ideas which could permeate easily in the society. They had studied for a long time, and their capacity for rhetoric, their skills were so high that were able to convince the masses in a time of upheaval. So they were able, as Lenin had done in 1917, to channel the discontent of the people to seek emancipation and reach the independence in all the countries in Africa and Asia from 1945 until the 1970s. In that sense, according to Professor Arno Meyer, it was fundamental to understand how after 1945, this kind of coalescing between the formerly predominantly agrarian societies that were ruled by traditional elites were now subjected to rapid process of modernization as a consequence of the war, and this create a independence. It is important, both the change of social consciousness of the people and the systematic shift of a structure which create the material conditions in order for the emancipation. So, as von Albertini conclude, the emancipation of Asia and Africa should not be understood as a mere byproduct of the wars in Europe, but as an integral part of the structural change in the world political constellation which had been developing since the turn of this century, characterized on the one hand by a transfer of power from Europe to the non-European world, and on the other hand by a Europeanization or Westernization of this later world. The travel of ideas, the new power structures, the industrialization, the creation of consciousness across the world in merely 30 years was fundamental to shift the new order after the Second World War. So, if before 1945 France and Great Britain were undoubtedly the masters of the world for their colonial occupation in the whole planet, later on the Soviet Union and the United States, that they were in favor of independence in Africa and Asia, were able to hold the new idea that the former colony system could not hold it anymore. And even though with process that become very violent in some sense, like the Algerian War of Independence, which finished in 1962, or the Momo Rebellion, which carried a huge repression in Kenya by the British forces. Eventually, all these territories gained the independence from the former masters.